Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
So, we will begin with a very quick recap of whatever we had been discussing so far in the last couple of sessions. Mostly we had been taking a look at the ways in which historically this genre has been located in particular ways. And we also began with this very controversial remark by Rushdie in his vintage book of Indian writing, which he also co-edited with Elizabeth West. This is what he said: the prose writing, both fiction and non-fiction, created in this period is proving to be a stronger and more important body of work than all the official languages, the writings in the vernacular. And this also represents, he concludes, the most valuable contribution India has yet made to the world of books. And there is also a range of things that he talks about, which we, some of those things we tried to situate the historic nature of those articulations. We also tried to see from where these biases against Indian writing, Indian literatures in other languages are coming from. What was the historic need to locate two different camps, Indian writers in English versus Indian writers in other languages. And in order to do that, we also access certain works. We had particularly taken a look at two works, one edited by Arvind Krishna Mehrotra, Illustrated History of Indian Literature in English, and the other an earlier work and the pioneering work by Srinivasa Iyengar. And M.K. Naik's work, though we have not really taken a look at the work per se in detail, we also in the discussions got a sense that M.K. Naik pretty much articulates and reiterates most of the things that Srinivasa Iyengar said. What makes Naik's works more distinctive is perhaps the fact that it was a Sahitya Akademi publication. So he was commissioned by the Sahitya Academy to write this particular literary history. So there is a way in which Naik also further legitimizes the many things that Iyengar talks about in his Indian writing in English. There were certain observations, certain similar sorts of tracing that we located in all of these works, and when they all tried to locate the origins of Indian writing in English, this invariably had a very similar kind of trajectory, though their articulations, the rhetoric of it differed, the way in which they accented particular things rather than other things, or those things perhaps differed, but other than that there are these similar origins. First of all, they speak about colonial encounter particularly with a very emphatic accent on the aspect of modernity, about colonial modernity. And also there are differing ways in which you can talk about colonial modernity. Those are perhaps discussions that you can come back to when you talk about individual works and authors. And there is also an emphasis being placed on English education and the role of English education, not just as a formal set of education, but also in the way in which the Indians who are educated in English were also getting familiar with a number of works published originally in English in the Western context. So all of those things collectively, they seem to have a major import in producing various kinds of new kinds of prose writings and novel writings in English and vernacular languages. So it also brings our attention to the role played by the vernacular languages and literature, which all of them interestingly agree about. Maybe the sort of accents that they place on the degree of the influence that may differ, but otherwise there is a general consensus about how with the advent of English education, with this advent of modernity, there is also a particular kind of vernacular literary tradition which was also emergent, and that in certain ways it also exists as a parallel to the Indian writers and Indian writings in English. And Mehrotra and Srinivasa Iyengar, they also draw our attention to these varied kinds of things which are happening, the emergence of how printing presses, not really the emergence of the printing presses, but particularly how the emergence of a certain kind of a print culture in English. It also accelerates this process. There is this journalism activities happening not just in English but also in a number of in Indian languages. About the missionary activities, though we do not find a particular kind of an emphasis placed on the missionary activities, that's also being discussed. There is nationalist history and nationalist movement, of course, with Gandhi and many other nationalist reformers. They are also being designated this the title of the the ones who wrote the first biography, such as Ram Mohan Roy, or the ones who inaugurated a certain literary tradition of writing in English, so on and so forth. And Gandhian influence is something that needs to be underscored throughout, and it also comes back to visit us in multiple ways when we talk about the novels of the 1920s and 30s, and also the novels of the 1980s, which revisit the nationalist history. Language debates, they also take such a enormous proportion that there are constitutional interventions which are needed in the form of language bills. Yeah, it's needed to contain the debate, the various problems, the issues related to communities, linguistic communities, the issues related to linguistic communities, say, getting at loggerheads with each other. So, there are also certain events, moments, and particular literary, non-literary figures who are being foregrounded, such as the British domination and the various ways in which happens. So, if you remember, there is an emphasis that they all plays on events such as the Battle of Plassey, the Battle of Buxar, about the granting of this Diwani, and also the role played by the Orientalists, and whom Srinivas Iyengar also refers to as the Brahmanized Britons, with the kind of role that they played in elevating the status of the Indian languages, Indian culture, in though with an Orientalist accent, of course. And then the celebrated Minutes by Macaulay in 1835, and a series of figures associated with Bengal Renaissance. And this again, we also recall, this could be a contested notion, but nevertheless it's also a very important historical moment to be reckoned with, featuring, say, Ram Mohan Roy, Bankim Chandra Chattopadhyay, the emergence of the setting up of Hindu College in early 19th century, 1817, and the role played by Derozio, Michael Madhusudan Dutt. Yeah? So, it's an amalgamation of many things, literary and non-literary, coming together, institutional and non-institutional practices coming together to eventually lead us towards the history of Indian writing in English. And there is this moment, 1857 revolt, which is responded to in multiple ways by historians, as well as there are these two early writings which are being made possible by Kailash Chandra Dutt and Shoshi Chandra Dutt, who talk about the possibility of an insurrection, who talk about the need for a subversive kind of narrative in the context of the anti-colonial movements. There is also this discussion about the first novels which appeared in the regional languages. Yeah, mind you, we are not really talking about the Indian writing in English, but also about the regional novels. So, there are these lots of discussions about the first novels which appeared, what were their characteristics, and how do they also act as a corollary to, say, 1835 Minutes, or the British domination, or the multiple ways in which they engage with modernity and the kinds of renaissances which were being made possible. Yeah, so, in that context, it is also important to remember, later when we look at Meenakshi Mukherjee's essay, The Beginnings of the Novel, she talks about how every language was vying with each other for this position of being the first, the very first novel. Yeah. So, that she also talks in detail about the many things which made the firsts possible. Yeah. So, moving on, some of the concerns, debates and frameworks that would emerge from these discussions, yeah, and this would also continue to dominate the many discussions that we would be having about Indian writing in English, particularly about Indian fiction in English. The most important one is the English Bhasha divide. This is either engaged with within the narratives of particular works, or we may be using that as a framework, as one of the concerns, or it could be one of the debates on which the discussions are being staged. This could also take another dimension in terms of the translations, and translations not just from Indian languages to the from Indian languages to English, but there are also these translations of iconic novels written in English, such as some of the recent controversies would be the translation of A Suitable Boy. Yeah. So, there was certain elements which are omitted in particular regional translations, and how various critics and translators respond to that. Those are certain debates that we would be visiting in course of this discussions. And the idea of bilingualism, about the authors writing both in English and in the regional writers also being forced to take a certain position about Indian writing in English or about regional writers. And this also has a historical context, as we have already noted in some of the discussions that we had. And we also saw these many births which are being spoken about. And these moments, these historic moments become important for us when we talk about Indian writing in English in terms of the canon, in terms of the literary tradition. Yeah. So, again, you know, this becomes important because these births, there is a certain canonical, traditional, conventional way in which certain convenient moments, convenient dates have been given as starting points, as births. But the moment you intervene with something like Dalit writing, or you intervene with say something like feminist writing or women writing, yeah. So, suddenly you realize that there is something wrong, there is something inherently flawed about these conceptions, these starting points, yeah. So, it also this framework, it need not necessarily always be, you know, cast in stone, carved in stone. It could also be certain platforms to for us to ask newer questions, to challenge the existing yardsticks or frameworks in many different ways. And these discussions about Indianness, Meenakshi Mukherjee has an entire essay about the anxiety of Indianness and how, you know, she locates a certain anxiety in the Indian writers in English to be Indian more than the others. This is like it's also an offshoot of the bilingualism, the bilingual practices that some of these authors had about English being part of a colonial residue and the native vernacular tongue being part of a more traditional and a more loyal nationalistic approach. Yeah, and also certain things which Mehrotra particularly drew our attention to, and these three aspects, in fact, will continue to be, it will continue to resonate with most of the works that we will be talking about. The idea of transnationalism, how global market plays a certain kind of a role. There's a way in which, you know, certain critics, again, you know, we go back to Meenakshi Mukherjee as an immediate reference. She talks about certain passages and how they were not written for the Indian audience. She talks about, you know, certain exotic India is being generated in the descriptions for a Western audience, for a predominantly Western audience. And it's the description, she says, a writer who is writing in one of the vernacular tongues, one of the regional languages, would not have resorted to this particular description. We will come back to those details at a later point. And post-colonialism is an interesting phenomenon and a very, very important framework within which we will be looking at some of the later novels. But also you would have noted, though we spoke about post-colonialism, though post-colonial moments were used as an intervention in some of the discussions that we had in the last couple of sessions, these writers per se, the historians per se, had not really referred to, had not really, you know, underscored the post-colonial moment much. Yeah, and also, you know, talking about the major frameworks within which we will be understanding most of the texts that we are talking about. Nation is a very important event over there. Yeah, and it becomes impossible to talk about most of these novels without referring to the nation, and also nation in that sense becomes both an advantage as well as a very delimiting component in some of the discussions. And these three figures, Macaulay, who is a colonial administrator, Gandhi, who is a leader of the nationalist movement, and Rushdie, who is an author in this post-colonial globalized market, yeah, who is catering primarily to the Indian writing in English. Yeah, these three figures, we realize that, you know, there is an uncanny way in which they come together in this field of study in Indian writing in English. Yeah, and Macaulay, if you remember in the introduction to Mehrotra's literary history, he talks about an excerpt from one of Rushdie's work, where Rushdie refers to Bloody Macaulay's Minutes. Yeah, so Bloody Macaulay's Men. Yeah, so there's a way in which a rejection of Macaulay and an adoption of Gandhi becomes very important to stage certain debates, to talk about certain kinds of Indianness and the absence of certain kinds of modernities. In the same way, Gandhi also becomes a problematic figure. An uncritical, you know, acceptance of Gandhi also becomes a problem. We notice that particularly in the post 1980s novels, where they are critiquing the very idea of the nation and also the ways in which the nation has been narrated. Yeah? And Rushdie, for a very different reasons, he becomes a framework because he becomes a trendsetter in a certain way. He becomes a yardstick against which the others are being evaluated. Though he is not really asked for it, Rushdie becomes the image, the face of post-colonial writing, and he also becomes such a towering figure that it becomes either either you have to be like Rushdie to match up to that sort of a standard, or you have to be continually in a position of being marginalized because you are not writing like Rushdie and others are writing. Yeah. So these three frameworks and these three very divergent frameworks, they continue to inform most of our understanding of Indian writing in English, particularly fiction, and also the evaluations, the evaluatory practices that we we mete out to these sort of writers as well as writings. Yeah. So today we begin looking at some of the things that Meenakshi Mukherjee talks about. Yeah, I hope you've had a chance to at least go through the 2 chapters from realism and reality. This is considered as one of the significant interventions that Meenakshi Mukherjee makes, Realism and Reality, the Novel and Society in India. She also wrote another book, an earlier work entitled Twice Born Fiction, in which she engages only with Indian fiction in English, but then she feels that it's an important moment. The 1980s she identifies as an important moment to also look at the history of Indian novel in general, because she thinks just like there is a particular tradition associated with the Western novel, it is very important to see a novelistic tradition which is native to India as well. So this is seen as a very landmark kind of text, not just for Indian writing in English, but also for Indian novels, the scene of the Indian novel in general. So she also begins on a very similar note. Yeah. So I hope you've had a chance to look at Meenakshi Mukherjee's both the works. Her work also begins with this, a tribute to Macaulay's Minutes. So in that sense, she is also not really departing from the major things that the other historians and the other critics had been talking about. There is this thing that you would find right at the outset in her the first chapter, From Purana to Nutana. Yeah, she talks about it is not an accident that the first crop of novels in India in Bengali and Marathi appeared exactly a generation after Macaulay's Educational Minutes, making English a necessary part of an educated Indian's mental makeup where past. Yeah. So her focus is on the educated Indian and how that becomes, that moment of the emergence of the educated Indian also becomes an important moment for the emergence of a certain kind of writing. Yeah. So moving on to the details, what Meenakshi Mukherjee in her preface also, if you take a look at it, she says her objective is to give a broader framework, a broader perspective, and also a theoretical framework to trace the development of novel in India, because these two things are clearly absent even in the beginning of the 1980s. There are no sort of, there's no way in which, you can approach Indian novel in general from a broader perspective, just like you could approach perhaps, the British novel, yeah, from a broader perspective. Yeah. So hers is like, she's in her work you can see that she is both a literary critic as well as a historian. She assumes both these positions to talk about the framework that she hopes will eventually evolve. So and she also identifies this novel in general as the second youngest narrative. Which is the youngest narrative? She says film, cinema. Yeah. She says novel is the second youngest narrative that is available to for consumption, the 20th century. And this entire thing, she begins to locate this at a level which is more than a literary exercise, and this is where she departs from all her literary ancestors, that she wants to locate the idea of Indian novel as more than a legacy of British rule. If you look at the frameworks which we had taken a look at, the ways in which the historical reasons, a certain etiology had been set. It's predominantly within a colonial framework, predominantly within a legacy of British rule. She's not necessarily departing entirely from that, but she's also drawing her attention to the need to be aware about certain other things which are outside of the colonial modernity, which are outside of these many things that we usually talk about. Yeah, in her own words, the Indian novel in general has been seen as born out of the tension between opposing systems of value in a colonial society and modified by certain indigenous pressures. But these modification by indigenous pressures had not been dealt with in detail until the early 1980s. Meenakshi Mukherjee is the one who initiates us into such a discussion where it is possible to bring both of these elements together. The tension between opposing systems of value in a colonial society and also the indigenous pressures, which also played a major role. And again, in the first part also, in identifying the tension between the opposing systems of value in a colonial society, she further fleshes that aspect out and draws our attention to certain things, very nuanced things, which had perhaps been overlooked by other critics and other historians. When she begins talking about the rise of the Indian novel, and here I also want you to recall the rise of the novel that you have learnt in the Western context about about how it was seen as a product of a renewal of the middle class. It was seen as a corollary of the rise of individualism. So these things she talks about in a very brief way, in just about 2 or 3 paragraphs. She talks about the emergence of the novel in the West and how that is also corresponds to the various moments of formal realism, and how it could be seen as a product of the middle class, and how it also celebrates the idea of the rise of individualism. And then she asks this pertinent question: so how do we begin to situate the same genre when we begin to talk about that in the cultural and historical context of India? What does it imply? What are the consequences? So for that, initially she draws her attention to certain pre-novel or traditional narratives. She speaks about some particular works, the details of which we will not be going into. She also does not really intend to stay on to discuss these the pre-novel traditional narratives. If you go through at a later point, if you've still not taken a look at it, from the end of page 8, page 9 and page 10, she draws her attention to certain pre-novel narratives which were available even before the advent of colonial modernity in India. As an offshoot from those discussions, she begins to talk about what makes the modern novel. She is not necessarily saying in a blind way that the pre-novel narratives were the actual in those pre-novel narratives we can actually locate the origins of Indian novel. She is not really trying to say that either. She is initially in fact most of Mukherjee's essays, if we go through them, her work, there is a systematic way in which she lines up a number of things. She not just tells us what she intends to, what her primary objectives in the study are, she also draws her attention to why she is not taking the many other alternate routes perhaps we would also be contemplating about. Here, since she drew her attention to the pre-novel narrative, she is also telling us in a very systematic, in a very illustratory fashion, that they cannot be the origins. You cannot trace it back directly to the pre-novel narratives from Sanskrit or from various traditions available to India from multiple sources, because modern novel, in her own words, is an organic product of a specific environment in a particular society at a given point of history, and it is also bound by historical and geographical coordinates. She also tries to differentiate, say, these fables and the works of the oral tradition from that of the novel, arguing that the fables and the pre-novel narrative, the traditional narratives, need not necessarily have a proper setting. The story could have happened in province A or province X or in an entire empire, such where the characteristics of those sorts of narrations, the plot arrangement, so on and so forth. So here she is drawing her attention to this modern novel. It is in page number 5, talking extensively about how a novel is not like a medieval tale. So she is also preempting the possibility of anyone later on coming and saying, see, it's not essentially a modern thing. It's also an offshoot of the many kinds of narratives that we had from the ancient literary traditions onwards. And that's also something that she does very systematically with a lot of clarity. And here, after having situated her definition of the novel, after having said that, I am also talking about a modern novel with proper historical and geographical coordinates. I am talking about a modern novel which is an organic product of a specific environment. Here in this case, the historical and social cultural context being whatever has been foregrounded by the Indian subcontinent. After having said that, she goes on to make and this thing what she does, this move away from the pre-novel traditional narratives to situate the modernness of novel as we are now aware of. That's very important thing to do for her, because she is also convincing us that I am talking about the same set of things that you are also talking about. I am not necessarily talking about the need for a different kind of historicity altogether. I am not trying to necessarily define novel in a new way for you. We are on the same page when we talk about novel. Yes, I mean novel. When I talk about novel, it's the same thing that the Western tradition also spoke about. But I want to differ in the way in which I situate it historically. Yeah? So, the way in which she situates it historically, it is within the world of the educated Indians. That's her own phrase, the world of the educated Indians, how that changed at the wake of the colonial modernity. That is the starting point of her discussion. She again begins with the significance of the minutes, as we noted earlier also, and then she goes on to talk about the educated Indian readers and the kind of text that they were consuming at that point of time. Yesterday, if you remember, from Priya Joshi's article, I showed you a table, the kind of translations of the 19th century texts which were available to the Indian educated Indian in the 19th century itself. Yeah, it's a very formidable, impressive list. So, the educated Indian reader, that same reader who also later went on to write full length novels, who also went on to inaugurate a novelistic tradition within India, they were in fact caught within a certain kind of a dilemma, because the society that they were reading from those British novels, which were predominantly productions of the Victorian society, and the cultural background that was their immediate reality, it was very, very, very different. Yeah. So, these novels were also even today Meenakshi Mukherjee says novels are written in urban areas by English educated people. That's just, that also remains one of the severe contestations against Indian writing in English. Yeah. So, that aside, this particular society that these readers were getting used to, which was not really tying up well, which was not really sitting well with the reality that they were used to, that actually gave rise to a discontinuity in tradition, a discontinuity in approach, yeah, because they knew very well that even if they are very, very impressed by the kind of novelistic productions of Victorian England, even if they wanted to write something like that, they cannot imitate the same pattern, because the societal immediate cultural social realities are very different. Yeah, she elaborates this further with two examples. One of the earliest Marathi novels, Manju Ghosha. Any Marathi speakers over here? No, are you familiar with this novel, Manju Ghosha? Okay, and also one of the earliest novels from in Malayalam, Indulekha. How many of you are familiar with Indulekha? Familiar in the sense you have read the text. Yeah, so it does not matter. In fact, these discussions are also quite important, and maybe if we have the time next week, we will also have a talk by one of the research scholars on Indulekha and what it really did to the Indian novelistic tradition. Yeah. So, coming back to this discussion, when Meenakshi Mukherjee is talking about these examples, Manju Ghosha and Indulekha, she is also drawing our attention to a central problem that these writers of novels were facing, because they were consuming a certain Western product. They were trying to produce a similar kind of a product for a different kind of an audience. So, the problem was to reconcile two sets of values, one obtained by reading an alien literature and the other available in life. This was, as she also says, maybe it is the same reason why only certain kind of novels were becoming popular in India. Can one of you, read out that brief passage, page 10, the last line of that paragraph?
It is not surprising, therefore, that the two 18th century novels most popular among the early generation English educated Indians were Rasellas and the Vicar of Wakefie, both of which emphasize moral qualities rather than narrated immoral adventures in the realistic settings of depot and field.
Yeah. So, the popularity of those novels also depended on the kind of, the cultural, the emotional setting of Indian readers. Yeah. So, she is, further telling us what this problem of reconciliation between two sets of values is. Yeah. Because the dilemma was that the Indian writers in English, they were writing in a form that required individualism, because that is a historical connection of novel, yeah, with the middle class and the rise of individualism. So, they were trying to write in a form that required individualism as a value, but they were also writing about a society that denies it. Yeah, this is where perhaps the most significant departure, the significant contribution of Meenakshi Mukherjee comes in. Yeah, she draws her attention to the world of the educated Indians. The dilemma was not really about colonial rule and the national movement. It was not about a choice of say whether Macaulay or Gandhi. It was more about the choices that one was making internally. Yeah, the tradition modernity conflict was about a certain worldview that one wanted to embrace and the reality that one was part of. Yeah, this in fact this also sets the stage for a lot of discussions. It becomes easier. What Meenakshi Mukherjee also does is it becomes easier for the other critics and readers to engage with this problem after that, because until that point of they knew that there was something tricky about this situation, but they didn't know how to articulate it. Yeah, and she gives this example from the Chandu Menon's novel Indulekha. He mentions in the preface, as stated at the outset, this is Chandu Menon talking, as stated at the outset, my object is to write a novel after the English fashion, and it is evident that no ordinary Malayali lady can fill the role of the heroine in such a story. My Indulekha is not therefore an ordinary Malayali lady. And in the if you I think it's somewhere in page 15 or a little earlier. Yeah. So, if you go to that section and read through, she gives further illustrations from the novel Indulekha, and she talks about how the novel is not really reflecting reality, just like it did in the Western tradition. It was not. There is realism as a narrative technique, as a prose technique, but it is not about a society, a set of men and women that the author was encountering in his daily life. It was about the kind of men and women that he would like to encounter as products of modernity, as men and women who are English educated and who are individualistic, who can make their own choices in terms of relationships, in terms of career. If you are familiar with the narrative, the plot of Indulekha, it is also about the kind of choices that an English educated woman is making about her relationships, about her about the way she would like to lead her life, about the critiques which are being offered against a number of traditional practices in terms of marriage, in terms of career choices, in terms of how the protagonist, the male protagonist also challenges the taboos against travel, how he exposes himself to a range of things which otherwise caste wise his occupation does not allow him to. So, it is about a modern society, a modern Malayali society that Chandu Menon has in his mind. It is not about a Malayali modern society that Chandu Menon has witnessed. Yeah? So, here there is an inherent problem in the way realism gets depicted, not just in Indian novel in regional languages, but also in, by extension, in Indian writing in English. Now, again recall the themes of those two earlier proto novels, Shoshi Chandra Dutt and Kailash Chandra Dutt. Yeah? They were talking about the possibility of an insurrection, because whatever they were seeing in and around them, it did not really lend itself to such a realist mode. Yeah? It was difficult to narrate that for whatsoever reasons. We will not get into those things, but because the so because again coming back to Chandu Menon, he is talking about a novel which would project into the future. His novels, the characters, the setting, the emotional dilemma, the sort of resolutions that the protagonist and the plot in general arrives at, it's all about something that he foresees. In that sense, the novel, if you take say Indulekha or an example from any other languages, there is an impossibility to connect with the society known to the author. Yeah? And that is not entirely anybody's fault, because in some form they are trying to mimic the Western form. They also realize this is not a form, this is not a society which is, the society is not yet ready for those sort of individualistic concerns that the Western novel is used to articulating. And in page 15, in fact, she also interestingly draws our attention to a certain paradox inherent in Chandu Menon's work. Yeah. Do you want to read out page 15 from say Chandu Menon, who proclaimed in the introduction to Indulekha? Are you all there? Page 15, somewhere in the middle of the page, the first paragraph.
Chandu Menon proclaimed in the introduction to Indulekha his desire to write in Malayalam a realistic novel in the English style, forgot the intention by the time he finished the story.
Yeah, continue.
The concluding lines echo the sentiments with which the oral recital of a Purana traditionally ends. All the characters mentioned have reached the summit of human happiness, and now may God bless us and all who read this tale. The last line of this passage reveals the persistence of the pre-novel conventions of narrative in spite of the author's conscious adoption of the European mode and his deliberate debunking of the mythic imagination.
So it's these details that Mukherjee pays attention to that makes her own study, her own analysis very, very interesting. I also want you to take notes about the kind of approach, the methodological and the systematic approach that Mukherjee makes. It's also useful when you practice your own sense of writing, how she draws from these multiple things, and she is also not afraid to contradict herself, not afraid to point out the contradictions which may damage the initial arguments that she is making, because she is open to the citation of a new inconvenience even when she is making a very pressing argument. Also read out this quote. Can one of you read out this quote about Western novel in India?
Whatever term for the novel was adopted in an Indian language, the formal and thematic aspirations of the early Indian novel were the same as those of the English novels read by pioneering Indian novelists. The English-educated generation, which came of age in India around 1860, was brought up on Victorian novels of the time and seems to have been influenced by these.
Yeah. So she again, also trying to say that maybe there are these contestations, especially within the native tradition, about whether this term can be used for novel or the other term can be used. She said it really doesn't matter, because regardless of the language in which you were writing, whether it is one of the regional languages or English, regardless of the language, you all had to move away from the familiar setting. You all had to write in a very different way and not necessarily produce a very Indian novel in that sense, a very traditional narrative based novel. You all had to mimic certain aspects, but also mediate in particular ways, so that that dilemma also is resolved. What's a challenge over here? What's a problem over here that she is again foregrounding? Yes, again to quote her own words, to talk about the incompatibilities between English and the Indian temperaments. She talks about, she is in agreement with all the others when she says novel initially developed in a colonial situation. Yeah, and where absolute superiority of everything published in English was taken for granted. I want you to pause over here, and then we will also take a look at one of the recent complaints. In 1992, Ejaz Ahmed, in one of his essays, he speaks about how the only literary document produced in English is now seen as the national document, all else is regional, hence minor and forgettable. So that English emerges in this imagination not as one of the Indian languages, which undoubtedly it is, but as the language of national integration and bourgeois civility. Yeah. So the sort of certain national status that English was being accorded to, it's not a new thing. Yeah. It was always already there for various reasons. She does not really, Meenakshi Mukherjee does not really explore the reasons behind that, but she says there was an inherent superiority for everything published, everything written in English. Yeah. And she also says maybe the problem was that we were not mimicking the right kind of English novel. She says maybe the British model was not really suitable for the Indian mind in the 19th century. Maybe they had to look at the Russian novels, which had a more philosophical bent to it, more explored the psychological dilemmas, rather than just talking about realism, which is what the British fiction in the early 19th century and in the early 19th century did. And she also thinks maybe when they imitated both the regional writers and the Indian writers in English, maybe when they imitated the wrong kind of masters, and maybe they imitated the mediocre English novels, often devaluing their own talents in the process. This is in fact, it's a very post-colonial thing to say. Yeah? This is where, Meenakshi Mukherjee also differs and departs from the others. Yeah? Because the others have been uncritically acknowledging the influence that the British novels had on Indian writing in English. Remember the appeals, the various kinds of appeals that Srinivas Iyengar was making to the English writer abroad, the Indian critic abroad, the Indian reader in India, yeah, for appeal of sympathy, yeah, asking for some kind of a generosity. But here is a post-colonial critic, Meenakshi Mukherjee, also exposing us to perhaps the mediocre nature of the originals which were being made available for us to copy, yeah, for the early Indian writers to copy. And also she talks about how there are basic incompatibilities between English and Indian temperaments, maybe which is why there are a lot of unresolved dilemmas both in narration and also in the criticisms that we employ. this is, you know, in the second chapter she draws attention to further a range of different other things, you know, such as Serampore mission press, the translation of the Bible into Indian languages, how the missionary enterprise became important. Yeah? And here in fact it is in this chapter which we shall talk about in the next session perhaps. First, you know, there is a historical value that she reassesses, and in the second chapter titled The Novel of Purpose, she is setting up certain literary yardstick, literary and critical yardsticks. Yeah. So, and Meenakshi Mukherjee also undoubtedly remains as one of the pioneers of, you know, who started practicing the art of criticism and using it on Indian novel, particularly in Indian novels in English. And till date, many of the formulations that we have about Indian writing in English, many of the ways in which we privilege one issue over the other, it's all based on the things that she wrote about, the way in which, you know, she framed the issue. So, we will come back to look at the second chapter, take some time out to, you know, just read through that essay, because that also, it's also in a certain way foundational to approach the kinds of frameworks which are being available for us to talk about Indian writing in English. Yeah? And also begin to use your critical faculty when you are even reading, you know, critical texts. Yeah? Are there places where you would differ, because you are also, you know, simultaneously doing a number of other courses. Yeah? So, does your knowledge, your reading which you gathered from another course, does it become useful to critically evaluate the critical piece that you are reading? Do not look at the critical work, the secondary source, as, you know, something which cannot be contested against. Yeah? So, because only when you begin to develop that faculty, it will begin to reflect in your the form of writing also that you begin to adopt. I hope you will have more to say, and I hope I will also give you more time to speak when we talk about the novels. Yeah? It's just that, you know, this stage setting is very important, I feel. You know, otherwise, you know, if we later, if we think when we discuss the novels, we will come back to talk about certain issues, it may not happen, or that may not be the right time. So, I thought the first few sessions, I'll just give you an outline of the available scholarship, the discussions which had been happening. So, it also allows you to move freely, depart freely, without, you know, coming back to the origins again and again. Yeah. So, in your presentations also keep this in mind. You are not really trying to go in tandem with the many things that we we speak about in the first few sessions, but you are also trying to move away from those in certain ways. Yeah. How these readings have, you're not really trying to replicate the similar kind of a reading in your own, say in your own reading of the novels. On the other hand, you are also trying to tell us how those things have informed your understanding. Yeah? And if there is a certain understanding that you already have, and if you do not know where to trace it back to, maybe that is again, you know, a thing that you should be doing. Yeah? As I think, you know, I told you earlier, I'm not very sure about this, the way in which we accept Rushdie as a canon, and the way in which, you know, we boo something like, say, Chetan Bhagat. Yeah? Yeah. Does it have something to do with the critical tradition which has inadvertently formed our reading habits? Yeah. So, how does, you know, Rushdie become part of the Booker Prize, and they say Chetan Bhagat at best, you know, you buy him at the railway station book counter. Yeah. So, how do these things really operate? Yeah. Is it about language alone? Is it about certain narratives that the writers are talking about, or is it also about the positioning of certain authors in, you know, certain ways, about the prizes associated with it, or the controversies associated with it? Yeah. So, I also want you to question these notions, not because these sort of questions will not just improve your understanding of Indian writing in English, but it also will allow you to question your general reading habits and how you engage with text not just, you know, in a bound book form, about the texts which you see around you as well. So, shall we call it a day?